The applause started before Ethan Cole even walked into the boardroom. Not for him. For the woman sitting beside the company's wealthy executive chairman. The same woman who had once promised to build a future with him. The same woman who had walked away from their marriage less than a year earlier. Vanessa Cole sat confidently near the head of the table, dressed in designer clothing that cost more than Ethan's monthly mortgage payment. Her hand rested casually beside Richard Harlow's. Everyone in the room knew exactly what that meant. No one even tried to hide their whispers. The divorce had become company gossip months ago. The struggling operations manager abandoned by his wife. The ambitious woman who married the chairman. The story practically wrote itself. As Ethan entered the room, conversations stopped. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Others looked almost entertained. Vanessa did not appear uncomfortable at all. If anything, she looked victorious. And why would not she? 3 months earlier, she had married one of the richest executives in the state. Richard Harlow controlled billions in assets. Private jets, luxury resorts, investment groups, corporate influence. He had everything Ethan never could. At least that was how it looked. What nobody knew was that Ethan was not paying attention to Vanessa. He was not paying attention to Richard. His eyes remained fixed on the empty chair at the far end of the boardroom, the chairman's seat. Because the company's founder had died 2 weeks earlier, and today, the board would announce who would become the new chief executive officer. Most employees already believed they knew the answer. Richard Harlow, the wealthy chairman, the powerful insider, the man who had seemingly won everything, including Ethan's wife. But there was one problem. The board members looked nervous, very nervous, as if something was not going according to plan, as if a decision had already been made, and not everyone liked it. Ethan took his seat near the wall, far away from the executives, far away from Vanessa, exactly where someone of his position was expected to sit. Invisible, unimportant, forgettable. At least that was what everyone believed. The meeting began. Legal advisors entered. Documents were distributed. And then one sentence changed the atmosphere completely. The lead attorney announced that the founder's final succession instructions would now be read exactly as written. Richard smiled. Vanessa smiled. Several board members nodded confidently. Then the attorney opened the sealed envelope. And suddenly Richard stopped smiling. Nobody understood why. Not yet. But something inside that envelope had terrified him. And before the meeting ended, everything would begin to change, because the man Vanessa had abandoned for a richer life was about to become the biggest obstacle standing between her and everything she thought she had won. The truth was far more complicated than anyone realized. And it had started years earlier, long before the divorce, long before the remarriage, long before the boardroom. Back when Ethan still believed loyalty mattered, back when Vanessa still pretended to love him. 5 years earlier, Ethan Cole had been one of the most respected employees inside Meridian Dynamics. Not because of his title, not because of his salary, certainly not because of his connections. Employees respected him because he solved problems nobody else wanted. When factories missed deadlines, Ethan fixed production schedules. When departments fought each other, Ethan found compromises. When executives made unrealistic promises, Ethan somehow delivered results. The company survived crisis after crisis largely because Ethan quietly worked impossible hours. Yet promotions always went elsewhere. Recognition always went elsewhere. Bonuses always went elsewhere. Every year someone with better connections moved ahead. Every year Ethan stayed exactly where he was. The strange thing was that he rarely complained. He simply kept working, kept helping people, kept solving problems. At home, however, things were becoming increasingly difficult. Vanessa was not interested in patience anymore. The modest house that once felt comfortable now seemed embarrassing to her. The reliable sedan became unacceptable. The vacations disappeared. The financial pressure increased. And social media made everything worse. Every day Vanessa saw friends posting luxury trips, designer purchases, luxury homes, perfect lives. Slowly, comparison turned into resentment. Resentment turned into disappointment. Disappointment became anger. And eventually, Ethan realized something painful. Vanessa was not upset about their struggles. She was upset about him. She began criticizing everything. His salary, his ambitions, his clothes, his work, his future. Nothing seemed good enough anymore. The man she once admired had somehow become the reason she was not living the life she wanted. At least in her mind. The arguments became routine. Small disagreements turned into major confrontations. Weekends became tense. Conversations became exhausting. Then Richard Harlow entered the picture. Officially, Richard served as executive chairman. Unofficially, he controlled almost every major decision inside Meridian. He was charismatic, powerful, confident, the kind of man who entered a room and immediately became the center of attention. Vanessa met him during a corporate charity event. At first, Ethan thought nothing of it. Employees met executives all the time. But afterward, something changed. Vanessa talked about Richard constantly. His success, his vision, his intelligence, his lifestyle. The comparisons started almost immediately. Richard would have done this. Richard understands business. Richard knows how to build wealth. Richard is not afraid to take risks. Every compliment directed toward Richard felt like criticism aimed at Ethan. The emotional distance grew larger every month. Then came the first betrayal. Not an affair. Not yet. Something worse. Humiliation. During a company gala attended by hundreds of employees, Vanessa openly mocked Ethan's position. She laughed about his stagnant career, questioned his ambition, suggested that some people simply were not meant for leadership. The comments spread quickly. Employees talked. Managers noticed. Even Ethan's closest coworkers looked uncomfortable. One of those coworkers was Daniel Ruiz, a senior logistics supervisor, a loyal friend, and one of the few people willing to tell Ethan difficult truths. Daniel noticed things others missed, especially where Richard Harlow was concerned. After the gala, Daniel quietly warned Ethan. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Richard seemed unusually interested in Vanessa. Meetings appeared coincidental. Conversations lasted too long. Private invitations increased. Ethan wanted to dismiss the concerns. He wanted to believe his marriage could still be saved. Instead, events accelerated. 3 months later, Vanessa requested a separation. The explanation sounded rehearsed. She claimed they had grown apart. Different goals, different priorities, different visions for the future. The language felt strangely corporate, almost as if someone else had helped prepare it. Then came the real shock. Only 6 weeks after moving out, Vanessa appeared publicly beside Richard Harlow. No explanations, no denials, no attempt to hide the relationship. Employees immediately connected the dots. The gossip exploded. The humiliation became complete. People who once respected Ethan now pitied him. Others simply assumed he had lost his wife, lost his future, lost the competition. Because from the outside, that was exactly how it looked. Richard had everything. Ethan had nothing. At least that was the story everyone believed. What nobody realized was that Richard's interest in Vanessa was not really about love. And Vanessa's interest in Richard was not really about love either. Both were chasing something else. Something hidden. Something connected to Meridian Dynamics itself. Something worth far more than romance. Months passed. The divorce finalized. Vanessa married Richard. Photographs flooded social media. Luxury venues. Private islands. Celebrity guests. Everything looked perfect. The message was obvious. She had upgraded her life. Meanwhile, Ethan continued working. Quietly, patiently. Without complaint. The contrast made him appear even weaker. Yet something unusual happened during those months. The founder of Meridian Dynamics, an elderly businessman named Leonard Mercer, began requesting private reports. Not from executives, not from board members, from Ethan. Nobody knew why. The requests were confidential. The meetings were discreet. And Leonard never explained his reasons. Several times Ethan attempted to decline. Each time Leonard insisted. The founder wanted honest assessments, real operational data, unfiltered information. And Ethan provided exactly that. The reports revealed troubling patterns, financial inconsistencies, questionable acquisitions, missing funds, projects that somehow benefited companies connected to Richard Harlow. Nothing conclusive, but enough to raise concerns. Leonard became increasingly interested, then increasingly alarmed, then determined. Daniel noticed the pattern too. The witness who always seemed one step ahead. He discovered that multiple executives loyal to Richard were quietly moving money through consulting contracts. Again, nothing illegal on the surface, but enough to suggest manipulation. The deeper they looked, the stranger everything became. Then Leonard Mercer died unexpectedly, and every investigation stopped. Or so everyone thought. Because 2 days before his death, Leonard had finalized something nobody knew existed, something that now sat inside the sealed envelope resting on the attorney's desk. Back in the boardroom, the attorney adjusted his glasses. Board members shifted uneasily. Richard's confidence continued fading. Vanessa noticed. For the first time all morning, uncertainty crossed her face. The attorney cleared his throat, then announced that Leonard Mercer had left specific instructions regarding the future leadership of Meridian Dynamics. Instructions that legally bound the board. No exceptions, no negotiations, no appeals. The room became silent. Not the normal kind of silence, the dangerous kind. Richard leaned forward. Vanessa squeezed his hand. Several directors exchanged worried glances. And Ethan sat quietly near the wall. Still invisible. Still underestimated. Still unaware that his entire life was about to change. Because hidden within Leonard Mercer's final instructions was a secret that would expose betrayals, destroy careers, and force the board to choose between power and truth. And when that secret emerged, Vanessa would discover that marrying a wealthy boss had been the biggest mistake of her life. The attorney broke the seal. Paper unfolded. Every eye in the room locked onto the document. The tension was immediate. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Almost physical. Richard Harlow attempted to maintain his composure, but the confidence that had carried him through years of corporate dominance was beginning to crack, because he knew something most people did not. Leonard Mercer had become suspicious before his death. Very suspicious. And Richard never discovered exactly how much the founder knew. The attorney began reading. Leonard's words filled the room. Not through a video. Not through a recording. Through a legally binding succession directive. The founder explained that Meridian Dynamics had reached a crossroads. The company needed leadership based on integrity rather than influence. Service rather than status. Results rather than appearances. Several board members shifted nervously. Richard's jaw tightened. Then came the first surprise. Leonard revealed that for nearly 3 years he had secretly commissioned independent evaluations of every senior executive. Every division, every department, every major decision. The assessments had been conducted without anyone's knowledge. Board members exchanged stunned looks. Nobody had known. Not even Richard. The founder had effectively investigated his own company, and the findings were apparently significant enough to shape his final decisions. The attorney continued reading. The report identified one employee whose recommendations consistently improved company performance. One employee whose forecasts proved accurate. One employee whose ethics remained unquestioned. One employee who repeatedly protected the company from costly mistakes. The room slowly began turning toward Ethan. Not because anyone expected what was coming, because they suddenly realized whose name had not yet been spoken. Richard noticed it too. And for the first time, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. The attorney paused. Then finally said the name, Ethan Cole. The boardroom exploded into whispers. Several directors looked genuinely shocked. Others looked relieved. Vanessa stared at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. This could not be happening. Not him. Not the man she had left behind. Not the man everyone considered average. The attorney raised his hand for silence. Then came the second shock. Leonard had not merely recommended Ethan. He had spent years preparing him. Through confidential meetings, private reports, leadership assessments, strategic planning sessions. The founder had quietly mentored Ethan while the rest of the company ignored him. The revelation stunned everyone, especially Ethan. Many of those meetings suddenly made sense. The difficult questions, the operational reviews, the requests for brutally honest analysis. Leonard had never been gathering information. He had been evaluating character. And apparently he had found what he was looking for. Richard immediately objected. Not publicly. Not yet. But everyone could see the anger building behind his expression. The attorney was not finished. Second envelope was opened. This one contained supporting evidence. Detailed evaluations. Performance reviews. Financial analyses. Years of documentation. And buried within those documents was something even more dangerous. Evidence suggesting that certain executives had manipulated company resources for personal gain. No names were mentioned initially, but everyone understood where the investigation was heading. The atmosphere changed instantly. This was no longer a succession meeting. It was becoming an exposure. Vanessa felt her confidence slipping away. She had spent months believing she had escaped a mediocre future, believing she had attached herself to power, believing she had chosen the winning side. Now the room seemed to be shifting beneath her feet, because the people who once admired Richard were suddenly avoiding eye contact with him. The board called for a recess. Small groups formed throughout the building. Executives whispered behind closed doors. Legal advisors reviewed documents, directors examined reports, and Ethan found himself standing alone near a large window overlooking the city, a city he had helped serve for years without recognition. Daniel found him there. The loyal friend looked almost amused. Not because the situation was funny, because he had predicted something like this. Not the exact outcome, but the collapse, the cracks, the truth finally surfacing. Daniel quietly revealed something he had never shared before. Months earlier, Leonard Mercer had contacted him directly. The founder wanted independent verification. He wanted confirmation that Ethan's reputation was genuine. Daniel had been interviewed extensively, so had dozens of employees, warehouse supervisors, department managers, administrative staff, people from every level of the company. The feedback was remarkably consistent. Ethan was not respected because he was powerful. He was respected because he treated people fairly, because he solved problems, because he accepted responsibility, because he never took credit for someone else's work. The qualities nobody noticed until leadership was required, the qualities Leonard apparently valued most. But while Ethan absorbed that revelation, something else was happening. Richard Harlow was fighting for survival. Inside a private conference room, he met with several loyal board members. The discussion quickly became heated, because new information kept emerging. Financial records, consulting contracts, investment arrangements, nothing individually devastating. But together they painted a troubling picture, a pattern, a network, a strategy. Company money appeared to have benefited businesses connected to Richard's associates. Again and again, year after year, the numbers were substantial, not criminally obvious, but ethically questionable. And Leonard Mercer had apparently documented everything before his death. The timing could not have been worse, because regulators were already increasing scrutiny across the industry. Any scandal could devastate shareholder confidence. The board now faced an impossible choice: protect Richard, or protect the company. Meanwhile, Vanessa experienced a different kind of fear. For months, she had enjoyed the privileges that came with Richard's wealth: the luxury homes, the private travel, the social status, the exclusive circles. She had convinced herself she deserved it, that she had finally escaped limitation. Now she was beginning to understand something painful. Most of that lifestyle depended entirely on Richard maintaining influence. If he lost power, everything changed. The realization hit harder than expected. Not because she loved Richard, because she suddenly saw how fragile the entire arrangement really was. That evening, news of the succession dispute began leaking throughout Meridian Dynamics. Employees filled message boards. Rumors spread. Speculation exploded. And one surprising trend emerged. Workers overwhelmingly supported Ethan. The same employees who had watched him struggle, the same employees who had witnessed his humiliation, the same employees who had seen him overlooked repeatedly. Many viewed him as one of their own, someone who understood the company from the ground up, someone who actually listened. Support grew rapidly. Board members noticed. Investors noticed. The media began noticing too. Then came another revelation, one that changed everything. A forensic accounting team hired by Leonard Mercer before his death completed its final report. The findings arrived the following morning. Several directors reviewed the document. Their reactions said enough. Faces turned pale. Phones started ringing. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Because the report identified something specific: a shell consulting network, multiple firms receiving substantial payments from Meridian, companies connected indirectly to executives loyal to Richard. The transactions were not necessarily illegal, but they created enormous conflicts of interest, and the documentation was extensive. Years of records, emails, approvals, signatures, patterns. The evidence was undeniable. By noon, independent investigators were brought in. By afternoon, shareholders were demanding answers. By evening, Richard's position had become nearly impossible to defend. Yet he was not finished fighting. Far from it. Richard launched a campaign to discredit Ethan. Anonymous accusations surfaced. Questions about qualifications appeared online. Old performance reviews were selectively leaked. Minor mistakes from years earlier were suddenly presented as major failures. The attack was coordinated, aggressive, desperate. But there was a problem. The accusations did not match reality. Employees knew it. Managers knew it. Even many board members knew it. The strategy began backfiring almost immediately. Each attack forced closer examination. Each examination revealed stronger evidence supporting Ethan. What should have weakened him actually strengthened him. And then came the witness nobody expected. A former executive named Claire Donovan. She had resigned 2 years earlier after repeated conflicts with Richard. Most people assumed she had simply pursued another opportunity. The truth was far more complicated. Claire possessed records, emails, meeting notes, internal communications, evidence she had quietly preserved after becoming concerned about company practices. For years she remained silent, until Leonard Mercer contacted her shortly before his death. Now she was prepared to testify. Everything. The board convened again. This time under extraordinary circumstances. Investigators attended. Attorneys attended. Major shareholders attended. And Claire presented her evidence. The room sat in stunned silence. One revelation after another. One document after another. One connection after another. The picture became impossible to ignore. Richard had not built influence through leadership. He had built influence through manipulation. Strategic favors. Financial arrangements. Political alliances. A network designed to protect itself. And now that network was collapsing, Vanessa sat motionless. Every new disclosure felt like another crack forming beneath her future. Because she suddenly understood something terrifying. The powerful man she had chosen was not winning. He had been losing for years. Nobody had simply noticed yet. By the end of the meeting, emergency votes were scheduled. Investigations were authorized. Several executives were placed on administrative leave. And Richard Harlow officially lost support from a majority of the board. The collapse was happening faster than anyone imagined. But the final decision still remained. Who would lead Meridian Dynamics? The answer would come in 48 hours. And during those 48 hours, one final secret would emerge. A secret Leonard Mercer had protected until his death. A secret hidden inside a third envelope. A secret so powerful that it would completely destroy Richard's last chance of survival. And when Vanessa learned the truth, she would finally understand why the board was no longer looking at her wealthy husband. They were looking at Ethan. 48 hours felt like 48 years. The entire company seemed frozen between two futures. One future belonged to the old system, the system of influence, favors, and carefully managed power. The other belonged to something nobody expected. A quiet operations manager who had spent years solving problems while everyone else chased attention. News outlets began covering the story. Industry analysts speculated endlessly. Investors demanded transparency. Employees waited anxiously. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Cole. The strange part was that he never campaigned for the position, never begged for support, never attacked his opponents, never tried to exploit Richard's downfall. While others fought for power, Ethan focused on keeping the company running. Factories still needed schedules. Clients still needed deliveries. Employees still needed leadership. That simple decision ended up influencing more people than any speech could have. Because while executives argued in conference rooms, workers watched who actually showed up. And Ethan showed up every day. The board noticed. The shareholders noticed. Even reporters noticed. Meanwhile, Richard Harlow's world continued collapsing. Investigators expanded their review. Additional financial records surfaced. More witnesses came forward. Former associates suddenly became cooperative. People who once protected Richard now focused on protecting themselves. The loyalty he thought he had purchased was disappearing. Fast. One executive resigned. Then another. Then another. Each resignation generated new questions. Each question generated new evidence. The pressure became relentless. Vanessa watched the unraveling from inside the luxurious penthouse she had once viewed as proof of success. Now it felt strangely empty. The expensive furniture, the breathtaking skyline, the designer artwork, none of it provided comfort anymore. Because every television channel carried another story, another allegation, another investigation, another reminder that the foundation beneath her new life was crumbling. For the first time since leaving Ethan, doubt entered her thoughts. Not because she missed the money, not because she missed the house, because she remembered something she had spent years ignoring. Peace. The simple peace that had existed before ambition consumed everything. Back then, life had not been glamorous, but it had been honest. That realization arrived far too late. The following morning, the board gathered for what everyone believed would be the final vote. Security personnel stood throughout the building. Media crews crowded outside. Employees followed updates online. The atmosphere felt historic. Then the attorney arrived carrying a final envelope, the third envelope. Leonard Mercer's last instruction. The room immediately grew quiet. Nobody knew what it contained. Not even the board. The attorney explained that Leonard had specifically ordered the envelope to remain sealed until the final leadership vote. Now the moment had arrived. The seal was broken. The document unfolded. And suddenly everything changed. Again. Leonard's final message was brief, but devastating. Months before his death, he had established a confidential leadership trust, a mechanism designed to protect Meridian Dynamics from internal corruption. The trust contained a special voting authority that would activate only if evidence of executive misconduct emerged. That authority had now activated, and Leonard had named its sole trustee years earlier. Not a board member. Not an attorney. Not an executive. Ethan Cole. Shock swept across the room. Several directors stared in disbelief. Others looked impressed. Richard looked destroyed. Because Leonard had not merely recommended Ethan. He had legally empowered him, years earlier, long before the succession battle, long before the investigations, long before the scandals became public. The founder had seen something in Ethan that nobody else had recognized. Character. The one quality money could not buy. The one quality influence could not manufacture. The one quality Leonard believed Meridian desperately needed. The attorney continued reading. Leonard explained his reasoning in detail. He wrote that intelligence was common, experience was common, ambition was common, integrity was rare, and during decades of building companies, integrity had proven more valuable than every other leadership trait combined. The room fell silent. Nobody argued. Nobody objected. Because after everything that had happened, the logic was impossible to dismiss. The vote proceeded. One director after another cast their decision. Then another. Then another. The outcome became obvious long before the final count. Ethan Cole was elected Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Dynamics. The room erupted, not with celebration, with relief. The kind of relief that follows a long storm. The kind that arrives when uncertainty finally ends. Outside the building, news spread instantly. Employees cheered. Messages flooded company networks. Workers who had spent years feeling ignored suddenly felt hopeful. For many of them, Ethan represented something larger than a promotion. He represented fairness. Proof that loyalty still mattered. Proof that character still mattered. Proof that the person doing the work could still matter. Richard remained seated long after the vote ended. The man who once controlled every room now seemed unable to control anything. His authority was gone. His influence shattered. Investigations continued. Board memberships disappeared. Business relationships dissolved. Within weeks, additional findings triggered regulatory reviews and civil actions. The consequences would continue for years. Not because anyone sought revenge, because actions eventually create consequences. And Richard had spent years creating his own. Vanessa's fall was quieter. No investigators targeted her. No headlines focused on her. No legal proceedings involved her. Instead, she faced something far more personal. Regret. The luxury lifestyle disappeared gradually. Properties were sold. Accounts were frozen during investigations. Social circles vanished. Friends stopped calling. The people attracted to status simply followed status elsewhere. One afternoon she found herself sitting alone in a nearly empty apartment. No assistants. No parties. No exclusive invitations. Just silence. And memories. Memories of a man who had loved her when he had nothing to offer except loyalty. A man she had dismissed as ordinary. A man she had publicly humiliated. A man she believed would never become anything important. She eventually requested a meeting with Ethan. Not because she expected reconciliation. Deep down she knew that chapter had ended. She simply wanted closure. The meeting took place months later. Inside a modest conference room. No cameras. No audience. No dramatic confrontation. Just two people whose lives had traveled very different paths. Vanessa apologized. Not perfectly. Not eloquently. But sincerely. She admitted that greed had influenced her decisions. She admitted that appearances had become more important than character. She admitted that she had confused wealth with worth. Ethan listened quietly. The anger he once carried had long disappeared. Success had not healed him. Time had. Perspective had. Growth had. He accepted the apology. But some bridges, once burned, remained part of the past. Both understood that. The conversation ended peacefully. Nothing more. Nothing less. As Vanessa left, she realized something important. The greatest loss of her life had never been financial. It had been personal. She had abandoned someone extraordinary because he looked ordinary. And by the time she understood the difference, it was too late. Over the following years, Meridian dynamics transformed. Employee retention improved. Productivity increased. Customer satisfaction reached record levels. The culture changed. Not overnight. Not magically. Through consistent leadership, Ethan implemented policies that rewarded performance rather than politics. Transparency replaced secrecy. Accountability replaced favoritism. Workers who had once felt invisible found opportunities to advance. The results spoke for themselves. Investors prospered. Employees prospered. The company prospered. And perhaps most importantly, trust returned. Daniel Ruiz remained one of Ethan's closest advisors, the witness who had recognized problems before everyone else, the friend who stayed loyal when loyalty carried no reward. Together, they often reflected on how differently everything might have ended if Leonard Mercer had ignored his instincts, if evidence had never surfaced, if truth had remained hidden. But truth rarely stays hidden forever. Eventually, it finds daylight. Years later, a portrait of Leonard Mercer was installed in the company's headquarters. Beneath it appeared a quote taken from his final letter, a simple sentence that employees passed every day, a sentence that perfectly summarized everything that had happened. Character reveals itself long before success arrives. Visitors often stopped to read it. Many admired it. Few understood how much sacrifice, betrayal, and courage stood behind those words. But Ethan understood. Every single day. Because he had lived them. The man once mocked for lacking ambition became the leader trusted by thousands. The woman who chased wealth discovered the cost of abandoning loyalty. The executive who believed power made him untouchable learned otherwise. And the board that once overlooked an ordinary employee ultimately chose him over the man who seemed to have everything. Not because Ethan was the richest, not because he was the loudest, not because he was the most connected. Because when every illusion disappeared, one truth remained. Integrity had been sitting quietly in the room all along, waiting for someone to notice, and in the end, that made all the difference.